Hey friends, and welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is our final Before You Read lecture on the book of Psalms. So we have moved quite quickly through all 150 Psalms in the Psalter, or at least we will have by the end of this video lecture and the reading for this week. So this reading for this week is for Psalms 131 through 150. That's basically the second half of Book 5 of the Psalter. And so I want to remind you of a few things about Book 5 of the Psalter, which we talked about in our last Before You Read lecture, and then some specifics for this final section in the Book of Psalms. So I think the first reminder is that there is this thing known as the book, or as the Psalms of Ascent. Remember, these were the Psalms that are correlated or connected with the pilgrimage of Israelites to Jerusalem from other parts of the world. Those times where they would make their way up to Jerusalem for the festivals and for worship. And the first four Psalms, Psalm 131 through 134, offer the end of these Psalms of Ascent, which we saw started in the earlier part of the Book 5 of the Psalter. Remember that with the first part of Book 5, I also invited you to reflect on God's concern, particularly God's concern for the least of these. Another I think common thread or thing that we see continued in Book 5 is the exaltation of God above other gods. I think we'll also see some elevation of Zion or Jerusalem in these Psalms. So in many ways, Book 5, the second half of Book 5 is going to continue what we've already seen. One of the surprising things about Book 5, at least to me, is that Psalms 138 all the way to 145 are associated with David again. It feels as though this is the place where the structure of the Psalms is really difficult to hold on to, because some of the Psalms are clearly written after exile, after the destruction of the temple, and then all of a sudden with 138 we're back into Psalms that are dedicated or associated with David. Many of these, the great majority of these David Psalms in Book 5 are pleas for deliverance. David sure seems like a needy dude in these Psalms. He pleads for his own deliverance, his own redemption, but also redemption for the nation and the people of Israel. So you might pay attention to that section of the Psalms. There is in this selection of Psalms a lot of praise. Besides the David Psalms that have some pleas for deliverance, there's very few lament Psalms. And so you may be aware of that. One of the more famous lament Psalms is Psalm 137. It is a deeply emotional and powerful psalm and has some very disturbing language at the end of it. So that might be a place for you to check out. As you read, I invite you to consider just a few things in particular, a few sort of motifs or themes to pay attention to. The first is pay attention to what these Psalms say about God's works. What does God do, or what has God done? Now, much of this will seem like a review. Much of this is not entirely unique to these Psalms. But again, it's a good place. You might just keep a list of all of the things that God does, the actions of God. And similarly, a second thing to focus on would be God's character. What do we learn from these Psalms about what God is like? God is just, God is faithful, God is loving, God is forgiving, etc. So again, you might keep two lists, God's actions and God's character. There's another thing to be on the lookout for, and maybe this is a little less pronounced, but nevertheless there. Pay attention to the presence of human vengeance in these Psalms. One of the Psalms that I was paying attention to has this idea. I mean, at one level, the psalmist talks about dancing and praising God, and at the next talks about walking around with a double-edged sword to inflict justice on the enemies. It's just interesting. Earlier parts of the Psalms have really been deferential in saying, God, you've got this, take care of this. And I noticed a couple of Psalms, a couple of quick turns in these Psalms where it seems to suggest that the human actor, the human speaker, is going to take action. So I wonder what you all would think about that as you read. Lots and lots to discuss, to think about. We will wrap up our reading of the Psalms with this reading assignment. Again, Psalms 131 through 150. I look forward to hearing what you have to say and what you think about these Psalms. And thanks, as always, for your time and your attention and your commitment to reading the Bible together.